3, 2, 1. And welcome to what I call Flight 1, a course by an air traffic controller and pilot for air traffic controllers, most of whom are not pilots, about how air traffic controllers can best assist during in-flight emergencies. This video is designed to help teach controllers about what a pilot is going through in all kinds of different emergency situations and give you the basics so you can watch the video and learn. But I also encourage you to jump in the flight simulator, the same one I'm using, or a similar one, and practice some of these flights yourself to gain a better understanding. So the mission for this video, the primary mission at least, is to demonstrate the basics of aircraft emergencies to ATC using a flight simulator. And for today's flight, we're going to use a so-called steam gauge Cessna 172, just the older style instruments rather than the fancy modern glass panel. But a Cessna 172 out of Indianapolis International Airport. I'm Indy Center, so why not do it out of Indy? In later videos, you'll see me flying all over the country, perhaps the world. I'm filming this on October 1st of 2020. And very briefly, some caveats. My intention is to put this slide up regularly at the beginning of each video and not read it. However, because this is the very first one, I do plan on reading this one. So first of all, this is not real flight instruction. That's not the goal of this video or this course. It's about using this kind of gaming flight simulation technology to teach air traffic controllers enough about how airplanes fly so that controllers can better understand how to respond to pilots who are experiencing a wide variety of in-flight emergencies. Now, specifically, there are many things about the software, the airplanes within the system, the simulated world, about the way I fly, particularly about the way I fly, because there's a lot of things I'm not going to do right. I'm not going to go through all the checklists that I would normally do. I could care less whether the nav lights and strobe lights are on in various situations. We're not going to use mixture the way I would in the real airplane. There's a lot of things that are different, and so this is really not a learn to fly course. But it's good enough to teach the principles that we're interested in learning. So we're going to skip the stuff that's not relevant so that we can focus on the stuff that is relevant. By the way, I'm Dean Brown. I've been a controller since 1990. Yes, that's 30 years ago. I've been a pilot since 1982. Yeah, that's coming up on 40 years. My first solo was on my 14th birthday in a glider. And I've been a certified flight instructor since 2008. And importantly, the opinions expressed here throughout this course are my own opinions. Essentially, they're an answer to a question about what I would do with my experience as a 30-year controller and almost a 40-year pilot and a 12-year flight instructor, what I would do to respond to a variety of in-flight emergencies. I'm really trying to distill things down so that controllers of various levels of piloting experience can respond effectively to a wide variety of in-flight emergencies. Very briefly, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, because we're going to be using Microsoft Flight Simulator and they're constantly releasing patches, I will just note the Flight Simulator version I'm using at the time of filming, because you might try this at a later time and have a different patch and things work a little bit differently. There's a little bit of information about the graphic settings I'm using. I do use what Microsoft calls the modern flight model. But you can tweak some of the realism settings. Just for the record, I do turn on what's called takeoff auto rudder. It just keeps the rudder in these airplanes is so sensitive. You kind of wander around on the runway and take off. I turn that on, just make it easier. Auto mixture, I'm not going to explain that. I turn that on just so I don't have to play with the mixture control during the flight. Unlimited fuel, I'm normally going to have turned on. That's just so I don't have to switch tanks on a regular basis, just avoid that distraction. It's not that I'm worried about running out of gas. What's known as gyro drift auto calibration for some of the gyro instruments, I normally am going to run with that on. Crash damage of various kind, I'm normally going to disable that. It doesn't really matter. Icing effect's not going to affect us in this flight, but I do have it turned on for this flight. But hey, you don't want to see all that stuff. You want to go fly. So let's go to Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'm going to click the world map. I'm going to change to the Textron Cessna 172. And there's a pair of them. So I don't want the one that says G1000. I want this one. Just the plain old Cessna 172 Skyhawk. I happen to like the tail number, November 123 Delta Bravo. 123 because I'm not very creative, and DB just because I'm Dean Brown. Hey, why not? Click out of that. Different ways to select the departure airport. I can scroll and zoom down in and so on. Or I can come up here and search for it. I'm going to go ahead and search for KIND, click on Indianapolis International Airport. It's selected runway 23 right. That's fine with me. As far as flight conditions, I turn multiplayer off, air traffic off. We got the world to ourselves. Weather and time preset, I'm just going to set the time slider to roughly noon, just for good daylight hours. Clear skies for this first flight, no wind. Turn that off. Hey, let's go fly. While this takes a few seconds to load, let me just mention a couple of things about Microsoft Flight Simulator. Pros and cons to simulators in general, pros and cons to this or any other simulator. The Microsoft Flight Simulator does have some definite advantages for this course as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to dwell on those. However, it's only been out for a few weeks and it's still a little bit buggy, and there's a lot of features that haven't been fully built out yet and so on. So there are some limitations related to that. Also, in any flight simulator like this, there's at least two big limitations. Number one, the visual cues that you get when flying, or quote-unquote flying, are very different than in the real airplane. Here, I'm looking at a monitor, you're looking at a video, so we both lack kind of the peripheral vision sort of stuff. I'm just going to click Ready to Fly. It's going to put us on the runway, and we'll get back to that in a second. But also the way you manipulate controls and views and things. So in the real airplane, I might just reach down and grab a knob and turn a knob to change, some radio frequency or do something. Here, I got to take the mouse and click on it or zoom in to focus on it a little bit and click. So there are some limitations like that. Speaking of the views, let me show you what we can do. So this is obviously the default view. We can see some of the instrument panel. We can see out in front of us. If we want to, we can kind of sit up in the seat with the space bar. Hit the space bar again, it puts us back down. I've got a hat switch here so I can look around at different points, and you'll see me doing that. You can manipulate the views in other ways. So for example, if I go Control 1, you can zoom in on just part of the instrument panel, and it's temporarily hidden the yoke. If you ever get lost in the views, you hit F. It takes you back to the default view. And sometimes one of the things you can do is you can toggle the yoke visibility, just get the yokes out of your way so you can see the instruments better and so on. Okay, so that's some of what you can do with views. You can also go outside the airplane, and let's come outside here for a second. It does put up what they call the HUD, the heads-up display, with some information, mostly around the bottom and so on. But I want you to look at the airplane for a second as I introduce you to the controls. And for the basics, you probably know already that if we use the elevator and pull the elevator back, the elevator, or the yoke back, the elevator goes up. That would normally bring the nose up. You can push forward on the yoke or the stick, the elevator goes down, and the nose would go down in the airplane. To use the ailerons, you move the yoke or stick left and right, and that moves the ailerons out here by the wingtips, and they move opposite. So if one goes up, the other goes down. The rudder on the tail moves right and left, and you'll see all of these in flight. And at the moment, the flaps are down 10 degrees for this airplane. You can see the flaps down a little bit. In the simulator, this is showing one notch of flaps down, which is 10 degrees. I'm going to put them up for takeoff. Cessna 172, you can take off with no flaps or 10-degree flaps. I'll just leave the flaps up for the takeoff and so on. But you get some basic ideas. Let's go back inside. Let's hit F, and let me just spend just a moment giving you the very basic introduction to the instruments. These are all pretty straightforward. So we're going to look at the primary six-pack, as it's called, of instruments that a pilot would use, plus the tachometer. We'll just start with the tachometer since we're down there. Right now we're idling at about 700 RPM, and this is a fixed pitch propeller airplane, so we have no independent way to control the pitch of the propeller and have that relate to the RPM of the airplane. So throttle is our only real power control. This is the airspeed indicator up here. This particular one is in airspeed in knots, and we won't dwell on it, but I want you to notice there's a white arc from 40 knots up through 85. The white arc is basically the airspeed range for operating with full flaps. There's a green arc that goes from about 48 up to about 130. That's the normal operating speed of the airplane. There's a yellow caution area and a red line. This is the attitude indicator. It replicates the outside world in symbolic form. Blue for sky, brown for ground, and there's some various tick marks for roll angles and pitch angles if you want to use that during instrument flight. Here's the altimeter. This is the knob that you would use to change the altimeter setting. Right now we've got clear sky, so it's set for 2992. And because we use the knob to set 2992 appearing in this window, this is showing our altitude above sea level of just under 800 feet. This is just under 1,000. That's between 700 and 800. So we're at 780 feet right now. Vertical speed indicator, we're level because we're just sitting on the ground, so it's showing 0. If it was here, it would be 500 feet per minute climb. If it was here, it would be 1,000 foot per minute descent and so on. This particular airplane, the instrument pegs at 2,000 feet per minute climb or descent. This is the directional gyro. You can think of it as the compass. This is the actual compass. The compass, we'll talk about in later sections of this course, has various errors and pros and cons. So normally we don't use this compass too much. We'll set the DG from time to time relative to this compass. In this particular airplane, if you ever want to set the altimeter and the DG within the simulator, you hit B to set the altimeter, it's already set. You hit the letter D to reset the gyro and just correlate that with what it is. But essentially this is our moment-to-moment compass during the flight. This is the turn coordinator over here, and it shows some information that we're not going to get into right now. So other than that, we're going to pretty much ignore all these instruments here. We'll cover a couple of them very briefly later on during the flight. We're going to ignore the navigation equipment over here, pretty much ignore the radios. All we have to do now is a couple of basic things before we get started. So first of all, I am not going to teach takeoffs the right way. This course is about learning how to deal with in-flight emergencies, not emergencies that take place in the first 10 seconds of the takeoff roll. So essentially we're going to skip learning takeoffs the right way. We do want to do what I consider just kind of a quickie checklist. First of all, anytime you're at a towered airport within the sim, it puts you on the tower frequency. So right now we're on 120.9er. If I leave it there, tower's going to bark at us during the flight, and that's the last thing I want on this flight is a bunch of fake controllers telling us what to do. So I'm just going to flip-flop the active frequency of 120.9er with the standby frequency of 124.85 using this C with the double-headed arrow. So I hit that, it flip-flops those two. We're now on 2485. As far as tower is concerned, we're Nordo, but too bad fake controllers. So we're just going to check the comm radio. The flaps, I've already put them up, but the flaps, one way or the other, are where I want them. The pitch trim, and you're going to really learn about the most boring thing that you might think of on this instrument panel, this little wheel here about pitch trim. You are going to really understand pitch trim. If you learn one thing on this flight, it's about the role of pitch trim. For the moment, I just want to point out there's a wheel within the simulator. I can grab it and move it with the mouse. I can put the mouse over it and roll it and so on. And whenever I do, you see that little white tick mark there that happens to be aligned with that little takeoff triangle. You're smart enough to figure out we'd like that white tick mark pretty much lined up with that triangle. Also, on a 172, I'm going to put this yoke back to where it's visible. There's a couple of electrical switches on the yoke over here, and obviously in the real airplane, you don't get a digital readout by just putting your thumb over the switches. But in this particular airplane, if I put it on this side of the switches, you'll see it says nose up. If I put it on this side of the switches, it says nose down. Either way, it shows we're at 1.1 degree positive on pitch trim. Don't worry about that as an absolute value. I can click on that, and each time I do, it moves it down. I can put it back. The default was at 1.0, and I'm going to leave it on 1.0 for takeoff, and that's the exact location. And I'm just leaving it there because that's the default position, and I want that for consistency. Last thing before we take off is we'd really like to turn the parking brake off. We're not going to roll very far. A little tough to see. It's this handle down here. You click on it, you see the toe brakes come off. I'll put the yoke back up so it's visible. Let's go fly. To reset the view, we hit F. For takeoff, I'm going to hit space. That seems a little high, so I'm going to tip the view down with the hat switch. Various times you'll hear me talk about hitting F, space, tip, just for that thing where we go to the default view, sit up, and tip the view down a little bit. So that F space tip is something I'd like to see Microsoft improve, but you'll see me do that a lot. Hey, enough of me talking. Let's go fly. I'm not teaching this the right way. I've got my feet on the rudder for steering. I'm going to start on this first takeoff by just advancing the throttle about half so that we get rolling, and point out that we steer on the ground with our feet. So if I push the right rudder pedal, which is connected to the nose wheel steering in this airplane, we'll go off to the right. That looks like a bad idea. I'll push the left rudder pedal. We'll come back to the left. As I approach the center line, I don't have to hit this perfectly. I'll add some right rudder beyond the center line, but let's jam the throttle forward. Thrust back in our seat from the acceleration forces in a 172. Here we go. In this particular airplane, we're looking for about 60 knots or so. Okay, I'm not teaching takeoffs exactly the right way, but about 60 knots. I'll raise the nose a few degrees. Nose comes up, and we're flying. Okay, now, I said if you get one thing out of this first flight, I really want you to understand pitch trim, okay? And what I want you to notice about pitch trim, pitch is going to set kind of the neutral or natural location of the nose and pitch. So right now it's coming up enough. Notice we can't see over the horizon. If I sit back down by hitting the space bar, this in some ways actually does just about as good a view or a replication of what kind of view you get in the airplane in many airplanes on a takeoff. In the actual 172, for most people, you actually see just a little bit better than this. But notice, what can we tell with this view? Well, we can't see directly out in front of us, so we kind of have to use this area over at our 11 o'clock position. For years, I've called this the 11 o'clock triangle. Recently, I've converted my own phraseology after hearing somebody else describe this as the Lindbergh reference. So look over at that Lindbergh area. Charles Lindbergh, flying the Spirit of St. Louis, couldn't see anything in front of him, so he had to look through like this Lindbergh reference for most of the flight. But figure out how much information we can get from looking out that Lindbergh reference. Okay, we can tell some things in pitch. Ignore the inner marker. I'm just going to turn the marker beacon off as well so you don't hear that. Okay, so the Lindbergh reference. We can find out information about pitch. So at the moment you can kind of tell we're climbing, and you can tell that we're wings level, we're not banked one way or the other. If we change that, watch the yoke as I just pull it back just a little bit, and watch the Lindbergh reference to see as we bring the nose up. So the nose is coming up. If I push the yoke a little bit, the nose comes down. In the real airplane, this is just fingertip pressure. I can bank to the left, and you can see that in the Lindbergh reference. It didn't take much aileron. I can bank back to the right. Again, you can see that Lindbergh reference. You'll also see the horizon here while we're climbing. If we're in level flight, or if the nose is down in the descent, you'd have a better view over the front. But even when the nose is up, that Lindbergh reference is valuable. But one of the many takeaways I want you to have as I just continue the right turn here for a moment, one of the many takeaways I want you to kind of get out of this first impression lesson is that in particularly some engine failure situations, if you have the airplane pointed at the airport in an engine failure situation, I'm just going to roll wings level here as we approach north, but if you've got the airport at 12 o'clock and 3 miles, now granted the nose is up right now, 12 o'clock 3 miles, if the airplane's high at all, which is good, it's entirely possible that they can't see the airport. In many cases, it might be better to turn them 10, 15, 20 degrees off to the right deliberately so that they can see the airport through something like that Lindbergh reference and so on. Okay, in the meantime, for what it's worth, and I don't want to dwell on this, on the attitude indicator, you can see the nose is up a few degrees. Right now we're climbing through just about 3,000 feet. We're coming through 2,900. We're bouncing around at ballpark 800 feet per minute. Yeah, we're headed north. We're not turning right now. But the airspeed right now is steady at about 85 knots or so. I want to point something out. I've hardly touched the controls of this flight. When I first pulled the nose up at about 60 knots, I pulled back on the elevator very slightly, and then the airplane just flew completely stable by itself until I did those slight, pitch changes, and then those two banks and so on, and then rolling out of the turn. Other than that, including right now, I am not touching the yoke. If you look at it, it's not moving. It's got the very tiniest little vibration that they're kind of modeling or something, but I'm not touching the yoke. The airplane is stable in all 3 axes. The pitch axis, controlled by the elevator, the roll axis controlled by the ailerons, and the yaw axis controlled by the rudder. And I want you to understand what kind of happens with that stability. In a separate lecture, I'll cover sort of how the airplane manages to do it, the way the airplane designers build that in using physics and so on. But right now, I'm completely hands-off. The airplane is stable. It does have, though, ways to return to a stable situation if I disrupt it. So let's first disrupt it in pitch. So what I'm going to do, and the airplane is turning ever so slightly to the right at the moment. I don't have the wings exactly level. But I'm going to disrupt it in pitch. So notice we're just stable. I'm going to correct the roll very slightly here. Okay, so now our wings up. Doesn't really matter if it's not perfect. Okay, so let's disrupt it in pitch. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pitch nose down for a couple seconds, and then I'm going to let go of the controls, and I want you to watch how the airplane behaves when I don't touch the controls. So here we go. So let's push the nose down a little bit. No surprise, we're going to descend. You see the descent here, particularly on the vertical speed indicator. The airspeed climbs. And then I'm going to let go of the controls. As soon as I let go of the controls, what's happening is the airplane's trying to get back to 85 knots. And so just through the physics and the aerodynamic design of the airplane, the nose comes up. You can see that in the Lindbergh reference. Now it's overshot the 85. We've gotten a little too slow, so I'm not touching the controls right now. The nose comes down. That's beautiful. Eagle Creek Lake up there on the northwest side of Indy. It overshot 85 again. What it's going to do is it's going to oscillate a few times with kind of the slow periodicity of maybe 15 or 20 seconds or so, and it'll oscillate back and forth just slowly on its own a few times. At the moment, look at that, we're pegged at 2,000 feet a minute. Well, it's not going to continue that. So these oscillations, or the technical term is phugoids, is one of the behaviors of the airplane because it has pitch stability, and the way airplanes are designed, in the vast majority of airplanes, there's always going to be some exception somewhere, but the vast majority of airplanes will have this kind of phugoid behavior, sort of this gentle oscillation up and down, and if we leave it alone for a while, it'll eventually settle out back at 85 knots. Okay, so that's just the very basics of the pitch stability. Let's talk about roll stability here for a second, and I want you to notice something, so let me just sort of use the elevator for a second, and I'm just sort of interrupting those oscillations, sort of park the nose where I think it should be. Okay. So that's going to hold 85, I'm hands off. Okay, so let's do a bank again. This time I'll do it to the right. But what I want you to notice is two things. I want you to look for two specific things when I roll to the right. The first is what it's going to do in roll stability. So if I roll to the right, and as long as I don't bank too far, the airplane will tend to gently roll back to wings level. It's very slow. It's a longer periodicity. There's no oscillation, but it'll do that. But here's the other thing, and I really want you to learn this. If we bank the airplane, the nose comes down because some of the lift is being used to turn the airplane, not to lift it. So let's turn to the right. I want you to watch the nose come down as the only thing I touch is the aileron, and I want you to notice as the wings tend to roll level after I let go. So here we go. Let's roll to the right. You see the yoke move not very much. There's about a 30-degree bank, and we're just going to let it go. The nose comes down. It's the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for the 500. There's downtown Indy. The airport will be off to the right in a minute. But notice the nose came down, but that took us above our trimmed speed. So now the nose is doing its phugoid up. So it's got that phugoid thing going in pitch right now. Now the nose is going to start to come back down. And at 30 degrees bank, it's just about kind of stable, so the wings are hardly rolling level. I haven't touched the aileron since we started the turn. It's very, very slowly from 30 degrees in this particular airplane right now. I'm going to bring us back. Let's say I go to the left. So let's just interrupt it for a second, sort of park it. I'm just going to park it right about there. That's the pitch angle that I think is going to get us to about 85. Don't have to wait till we're at 85. Let's go to the left. Let's just go about 20 degrees this time. So 10, 20, let it go. 20 degrees, the nose is not coming down much. It's coming down a little bit. You see the airspeed climbing. I'm not touching anything right now. Okay, and from 20 degrees, we're already back to about 15 degrees. And if you look at it, the airplane is slowly rolling itself back to 0 degrees roll, wings level, on its own. I'm not touching a thing. Okay, so two takeaways. One, roll induces a nose down pitch change. And number two, roll stability, it'll just kind of slowly bring itself back as long as you don't go too far in the first place. The exact tipping point where the airplane's sort of balanced in roll versus wanting to come back or roll farther tends to be somewhere about 30 or 40 degrees for a variety of typical airplanes. I'm just going to stop the turn here, but kind of work our way back to the airport, which is, you can just sort of see it in the Lindbergh triangle there. You can't really see it, sort of hidden behind the clock and the airspeed indicator. Okay. Here's where we're going to have some fun. Now we're going to touch the rudders. I'm going to go to the external view for a second. So the rudder you saw was the vertical part of the tail. You know that, you're all smart. Well, you would think that when you hit rudder, and you saw me demonstrate it on the takeoff roll here on 2-3 right, it just moves the nose right to left. Well, it does that, but it has side effects, and these are amazing. So side effect number one of using rudder is it will induce roll, just like the aileron does. You don't normally use it to roll the airplane, but you can. If you're in the airplane, it would feel just a little weird as you kind of slide sideways in your seat. But yaw induces roll. And what did we just learn roll induces? Roll induces pitch. So when I did pitch, all it did was pitch. When I did roll, it induced pitch. Watch what happens now when I do yaw with the rudder. It's going to do yaw and roll and pitch. We're going to go to the left. Are you ready? Here's some gentle left rudder. So I'm adding some gentle left rudder. There's about 10 degrees of bank. There's about 20 degrees of bank. I'll stop at just shy of 30. There's 30 degrees of bank, and now I'm going to let off the rudder. So what's it doing in roll? You see the left turn. What's it doing in pitch? Well, we descended. It's starting to phugoid back up. The airspeed increased. Okay. So rudder had side effects in each of the other two axes. It's kind of interesting. Keep that in mind. We're going to use it later. Okay, in the meantime, while we're turning, I'll take advantage of something. You've been looking at the bank angle here on the attitude indicator. You can see the turn coordinator. Right now we're just about back to a standard rate of turn when the left wing is lined up against the left tick mark. We're in a standard rate left-hand turn of 3 degrees per second. And you can see the directional gyro showing we're coming through about a 300 heading towards west and so on. You can see the compass is indicating something similar, which as you come through west, the compass is actually fairly accurate. Okay, so let's go back to pitch stability and understand pitch a little bit. The pitch trim, what it really does is it sets the neutral or natural speed of the aircraft. I'm just going to kind of roll out using some aileron here as we head off to the southwest. The airport is off to the left. You can see it over here if you want. There's the airport. If I hit F, we go back to the... Oops, I hit V by mistake and it brought up the V for a minute. Okay, so let's go back here. We're just in stable flight. About 85 knots. It's still doing a little bit of a phugoid. Now, here's the thing. Pitch trim controls speed, and that is different from what our brains are hardwired because of the way we, grew up pedaling bicycles and then driving cars, right? You want to go fast in a car, you hit the gas. You want to go slow in a car, you hit the brake, okay? Well, in an airplane, for all intents and purposes, your climb descent rate and your speed, those two things are a function of the combination of pitch and power. Now, the configuration of the airplane, that is with flaps up or down, gear down, stuff like that, the weight of the airplane and so on, does affect it as well. But essentially, the pitch of the airplane plus the power setting for any given configuration is going to give you an airspeed and climb or descent combination. But if you really break it down on some fundamental level, pitch trim controls the speed of the airplane, and you can override it short term or you can override it long term if you just want to muscle the yoke and hold it in some position. Okay, so to show that right now, and I've not touched the trim, again, it's very slowly working its way back to 85. I'm just going to get a wings level here. It's, somewhere about 90 or 85. It's not exactly going to hold something perfectly. But here's the thing. We're still at full throttle. Okay, I've got the throttle all the way, and if I mouse over, you can see it says throttle control 100%. Watch what happens. Again, we're speed stable at about 85, 90 knots as we go from full power all the way back. I'm going to do it with the control on my yoke. Ready? Throttle comes all the way back. You see if I mouse over it says 0. The RPM is dropping on the tachometer. I'm going to tip the view back up just a little bit. Look at what it's doing in pitch. It's starting a phugoid. I'm just going to correct the slight left bank. Okay, which is unrelated. It's just because I didn't have it perfectly banked and so on. It's starting a phugoid. So I pulled the power back, and what did the speed do? The speed went up initially when I pulled the power back. Does that make sense? I went from full throttle to no throttle. I took my foot off the gas, so to speak, and we sped up. Now it's going to start these phugoids, okay, and I'm going to spare you watching, the next 3 or 4 minutes of the video. We're going to interrupt this. But if we let it go, it's going to be speed stable at right about that 85 to 90 knot airspeed, okay? If anything, it's actually a touch faster if you want to be absolutely perfectly technically correct about this, because we're not blasting as much air over the tail from the prop. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to be speed stable, full throttle, zero throttle, anywhere in between, right about 85 to 90 knots, because that's how we have the airplane trimmed. If I want to change the airplane's speed in some meaningful way, we're going to do it with pitch trim, or you could override it, you could muscle it with the yoke. So let me show you that. Right now it's doing a small phugoid. The nose is coming up very slightly, and so we're slowing from 100 to about 90 or so, but I'm not going to I'm not going to make you wait and watch all these phugoids. Watch what happens if I trim forward. So I'm just going to click. I wouldn't do it this way normally with the mouse, but watch what happens if I go from 1 degree to 0. Ready? Hang on, buckle your seatbelts. So I'm just going to click this once, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll tip the view back up a little bit. Okay. The airspeed is climbing. Now it's going to do a little bit of a phugoid as it tries to settle out at some new speed. I don't know what that speed's going to be, but if I were to let it go, we're probably trimmed now for something like 100 to 105 knots. So pitch trim on some fundamental level controls the speed. Power really changes this. They work in combination, but I want you to think of it that way. So let's do this now. What happens if we trim nose up? Okay, let's bring it back to say 2 degrees. So I'm going to bring the trim up to about 2 degrees. The nose is coming up as we start a big old phugoid. Okay. Temporarily, that's going to peak at about 900 feet per minute. We slowed up to just about 72 knots there at the top of that phugoid. That'll oscillate a little bit. By the way, the airplane does do some very slight wandering in roll and hence heading sometimes. So every once in a while you'll see me just kind of fix the heading a little bit to keep it perfectly wings level. I didn't touch the pitch right there. It's going to phugoid a little bit, okay, because of that pitch trim change, and that new airspeed that it's going to be trimmed for is probably somewhere in the 75 to 80 knots. I don't know exactly. Okay, so pitch trim really controls the speed, but I've got the power pulled back to idle. I've had it idle for a couple minutes, so overall we're descending. If I want to level off, what can I do? I'm going to add some power. I'm just going to ballpark this. I'm going to add probably close to half power, maybe just a little bit less. I'm just kind of ballpark. And as I do, it looks like I'm going to add just a little bit more. I don't care about what particular altitude we've leveled off at, but it looks like, thanks to adding throttle, and assuming we're not phugoiding around, using just throttle, I've got this back to level flight. I'm not touching the elevator one bit. I haven't touched the elevator in minutes here. We seem to be just about level, 3,700 feet, and thanks to that 2 degrees nose up pitch trim, we're about 80 knots or so. Okay? Now, you want to see some emergencies. That's why you came to this course. So very briefly, one of the things that I expect Microsoft to build out in the near future, they haven't put in this brand new simulator right now, is some of the failure modes. So we're just going to very briefly touch on them. If we have a vacuum pump failure, okay, we would lose the vacuum pump. We would get some warning lights up here. And the vacuum pump is used to power the gyros that drive the attitude indicator and the directional gyro. We would lose those two. Let's just assume for the moment that we were to lose these two instruments because we had a vacuum pump failure. Folks, it's day VMC. It's not an emergency. That's not even a nuisance. It's barely even a curiosity. Okay, as I just level the wings briefly. It's a nothing burger, right? IMC in an airplane like this, in the real world, pilots are supposed to be able to handle it using the turn coordinator and these other 3 instruments. They don't handle it so well. It's a life-threatening emergency. IMC, day VMC, it's a nothing burger, okay? If the pitot tube gets blocked, probably from icing, can be from something else, the airspeed indicator is not going to work. If we lose the static port due to some kind of blockage or something, we can, in many airplanes, you can go to an alternate static port valve, pull that open, or manipulate it in the way that particular airplane would have it. But if we don't have that and the static port's blocked, that affects airspeed, altimeter, and vertical speed. By the way, I don't have the throttle perfectly set to maintain level flight, so we're slowly descending. I'm going to add just a little bit of power. It's showing 41. I'm just moving it a skosh on my yoke. If I go back to the mouse here, it's showing 52. Okay, whatever. That's probably going to get us level flight or a slight climb. I don't want to descend too much right now. So if you have a vacuum pump failure, you lose these two. Pitot, you lose this. Static, you lose this, this, this. Don't worry, there's not a quiz later, okay? The turn coordinator is electrically powered. Let's talk about the electrical system for just a second. I'm going to get rid of the yoke just so we can do that. I'm going to simulate an electrical failure in terms of an alternator failure. So if I turn the alternator off, all right, we get a voltage warning. We see the ammeter move in a way that's not quite realistic right now. The voltage went from 28 volts to 25 volts to show we're on the battery, and that would drain down. We would want to start turning off lights and turning off other things like maybe the transponder, because that's a high amperage draw and so on. But the airplane is still working just fine. Okay, and in terms of what's electrical on each airplane, it does vary airplane to airplane, but if we were to lose even the battery as well, I'm just going to turn the battery off while we're flying. All right, we lost the GPS, which I don't care about right now. We lost the comms. We're kind of ignoring ATC for this flight anyway, right? Okay, this stuff's working here. The turn coordinator's not working anymore, but hey, day VMC, it's kind of a nothing burger. It's not that big a deal. The flaps, if I put the flaps all the way down, I'm going to manipulate it on the yoke. It's not moving just because we select it. It's not moving. I'll put the flap control back up because these are electrically operated flaps. But notice the engine is still running just fine. Okay, the spark plugs get their energy from something known as the magneto system for virtually all aircraft. There can be exceptions, and there are exceptions with some of the planes here in the sim, but even with the battery off, the spark plugs are still getting power thanks to the magnetos. Right now I've got the key set on both magnetos left and right and so on. So I'm going to turn the battery and alternator back on, just get that all running. By the way, in a moment you're going to hear some beeps. That just means the autopilot is going through its self-test. Right now it's counting up through the second part of the self-test. When you hear some beeps in a second, that's just the autopilot. Okay, but the idea is whenever there's failures, just fly the airplane and you'll find, and again, I'm not, like, other than just these little tiny, aileron corrections, or I'm trying to, I'm jostling it right now, but except for me doing these little tiny, corrections or something, I'm going to do a slight turn to the left, just head back towards the airport. Except for those little corrections and aileron right there, I'm not touching the controls one bit. The airplane's stable. Pitch trim is an invaluable aid in a variety of emergencies. And a pilot who's really focused on other things, it becomes surprisingly easy to forget to keep the airplane in trim. Trim plays an important role, and I want controllers to have some sense of what pitch trim does. You'll find out in later lectures of this course that for controllers dealing with pilots who have an in-flight engine failure, in many situations, not all, the very first thing I would like controllers to say when a pilot has an engine failure is to remind them to trim for best glide speed. And there are other occasions where understanding trim becomes very important. So just having some sense of how the trim works is vitally important. Okay, also notice when I had the engine back at idle power earlier, we were still doing turns and the airplane was still flying just fine. Idle power is essentially no performance difference than an engine failure in this aircraft. So when an airplane has an engine failure, you can still maneuver, you can still do some things. We'll talk more about engine failures later in the course. But hey, you want to see me fly with an emergency, and turning off the battery didn't really count, right? So let's create an emergency. I'm going to simulate, and later you'll see I'm going to teach you in this flight how you can yourself simulate doing this, even if you're not a pilot, a very serious emergency. We're actually going to do 2 layers of the emergency. So for layer 1, I'm going to talk about the serious emergency of what's known as a pitch trim runaway. Pitch trim is so important that if it becomes stuck, that becomes a problem. Now, let's just assume it became stuck where it is right now. It happens to be 2 degrees nose up, okay? All right, I can still maneuver the airplane. I can manipulate the elevator, and if I have to hold the nose down for a little while, okay, fine. So I've got to muscle the yoke a little bit. I mean, it's not a big deal for small changes for most airplanes, okay? But what if the pitch trim has what's known as a runaway? And so let's suppose, and we're going to set this up, and this is a realistic kind of emergency that can happen, okay, it does happen, that I hit the switch. By the way, Cessna 172, the reason it has 2 switches is precisely because both have to be activated before the trim moves to help prevent a pitch trim runaway, because that's such a serious problem. But anyway, so let's assume that we start to hit the pitch trim, and this goes all the way up to 4 degrees. I'm just going to do that. I'm not going to touch the yoke, and I want you to understand the behavior of the airplane. So there's 4 degrees. Nose came way up, right? You can see that in the Lindbergh reference. You can see it on the attitude indicator. So what's it doing? Do you understand what the airplane's doing? It's phugoiding right now. It's oscillating, okay? And it's going to return to some new airspeed. I don't know what that's going to be. I'm guessing somewhere 65-ish knots or so, okay? I'm going to tip the view up just a little bit. And that's what it's going to do. We can still outmuscle it. So we could fly the airplane with this pitch trim stuck at about 4 degrees nose up, and now for some reason it's stuck, or we were worried that it was doing something awful, and so we've got it shut off, which you can do in many airplanes. But now it's just stuck where it's at. I interrupted the phugoid there for a second. Okay. I'm going to make this even worse. I'm going to concoct a crazy kind of additional control problem emergency just for teaching purposes, because I want you to learn some principles here. I'm going to assume, and this is like crazy, this like can't happen. I want to assume for discussion purposes that something is now blocking the yoke. Something back behind the instrument panel came loose, a screw came loose back there, and it's come down, and it's lodged back in there, and the yoke cannot physically move. So think about where we're at. The trim is stuck and the yoke is stuck. I have no elevator, I have no aileron for the remainder of the flight. How are we going to land this thing? Well, first of all, I'm going to hit F just to reset the view. Space bar, tip it down just so you have a better view. What do we have? Well, keep in mind, what does rudder do? Let's do rudder to the left. hey, we can bank the airplane and control the heading of the airplane using just the pedals, and that's all I'm doing right now and for the remainder of the flight. I'm not going to touch the yoke at all during the flight. How can we control the pitch of the airplane if we can't touch the elevator and if the pitch trim is stuck? Well, we have two things at our disposal. Thing number one, I can pull the power back. There's idle power. The nose is going to come down. Now it's going to phugoid a little bit as I just roll out on this heading to the southwest, kind of paralleling Interstate 70. I know the local area well enough to know that Indy International is back behind us a little bit. But, okay, so it's going to phugoid a little bit, but that's because I made a drastic power change. That phugoid will kind of dampen out after a minute. There's another thing we can do in pitch, and that is move the flaps down. Now, I've done this both ways. You can do this either way in the airplane. We could leave the flaps up for the remainder of the flight, or we can put them down. For teaching purposes, I'm going to put them down so that you see what kind of short-term phugoid oscillations they cause. So I know the airplane's in a little bit of a phugoid right now. At the moment, it's pretty stable. Let's go 10 degrees flaps. I'll tip down enough so you can see that control move and so on down there in the lower right. Here goes flaps 10. I'm using the button on my yoke. 10 degrees flaps. In this particular airplane, it's phugoiding up a little bit. It will then phugoid down. The airplane will slow just a little bit. Most people would say, well, it's because we've added drag. Actually, it's because it's changed the trim characteristics a little bit, but I don't care. If you want to think of it as drag, that's fine, even though that's technically incorrect. So it did a little phugoid, and then it's settled out. I'm going to start to turn back to the right as we start heading back in towards the airport. So we've got this control emergency going on. Now, as I make the turn here south of the town of Plainfield, Indiana, and head back towards the airport, we'll assess whether we're too high or too low. And we took off on 23 right. I'm just going to land on the same runway in the reciprocal direction, so we're going to use 5 left for landing. You'll see it off to the right over at 1 o'clock here in a little bit. If I want to, I can move the view a little bit. And if I do that, and then I want to reset it, just remember F, spacebar, tip. Okay. They turn the lights on. In the sim, it seems like they've always got the approach lights on, even when they're not needed. But I'm using rudder. The only thing I'm doing for heading and bank control is just using the rudder, so I'm getting lined up with the runway. And what I want to do is try to find an aim point. For our purposes, I'm going to use where that first taxiway crosses, a couple thousand feet down. And it'll take a while to develop this feel. Obviously, I've been doing this for a long time, so I'd like to think I have a decent feel for it. But right now, I kind of sense that we're going to be a bit low. It seems like we're kind of trending down in this direction. So I'm going to add some power. When I do, it's going to induce a phugoid, so I'm going to add some power gently. You can see the RPM coming up, but you can also hear the engine noise changing a little bit. And the nose, unsurprisingly, is coming up, but I've now introduced a phugoid. By the way, let's add some more flaps. Okay, so let's go one more notch of flaps and go to flaps 20. It'll bring the nose up. It was coming down just a little bit on that power change phugoid, so let's go flaps 30. Oops, the nose is coming down. I'm just going to let it settle out for a second so you can see the phugoid. And let's go flaps 30. Nose is briefly going to come up. It'll then phugoid back down. Again, I'm not touching the controls. I haven't touched the controls in a few minutes here. So it seems like we're going to be a little low, so I'm going to add some power. And right now it's just rudder and power. I encourage you, if you have access to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, which is the new one, an older version such as Flight Sim FSX, X-Plane 11 or something like that. There's a couple of others out there prepared. I'm just going to kind of stick with the Flight Sim 2020 in the videos, but feel free to experiment with some of the other sims for an emergency like this, and experiment and fly this yourself even if you're not a pilot. Don't touch the controls once you get into kind of this situation. I've just got the pitch trim set either at the takeoff position or something a little more nose up. I'm making some minor power adjustments as I just try to eyeball heading here. I'm trying to mentally discount the fact that it's got some of these pitch phugoids going on, and if I want to go a little to the left, I can add some left rudder. I can bank the airplane to the left. Now that I'm aligned with the center line perfectly, I can come back to the right. It'll take a little while to calibrate your eyeballs and see what you're doing here, but all I'm doing is just trying to adjust power and rudder. That's all I'm using at this point because the flaps are down as we come in for landing without touching the controls. And this leads us to the final foundational lesson. A lot of emergencies, the actual threat doesn't occur until somebody touches down. I don't think that's news to you, but it's one reason to just kind of relax during most emergencies and think ahead about what's going to happen with the landing and so on. Here, I'd like to think I'm going to make a soft landing. As I get real close, I'm going to add some power trying to get that nose up, but if I do it too much, the nose will lift up too much. So this one might be a thunker. You never know. I'm doing this in a live shot, as it were. But so I'm going to bring the power back a little bit. We're trending just a little bit high, adding a little bit of right rudder as I fight to stay right on the center line. We're getting down to about treetop-ish height. I'll just kind of describe it that way. And in a second, I'm going to start to add a little power, a little more power, a little more power, more power, a little too much. Kind of ballooned it a little bit. Let's see if I can save it. Bring the power back. We're going to live with this. Touchdown. And then I'm going to use the toe brakes to bring it to a stop. All without touching the controls there in the final part of the flight. And the idea is to reinforce the role of pitch trim, which really controls speed, and power, which is going to really control the climb and descent rate, both of which have phugoids and really use the elevator to sort of interrupt those phugoids and so on. Aileron has side effects when you bank. It induces a nose down pitch. And if you use rudder, it's going to have side effects first in roll, which in turn induces pitch. So with that in mind, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint real quick, and I'll leave it this way. I encourage you to try it yourself. So use any of the single-engine, piston-powered airplanes in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. You can use other flight simulators as well. I'll kind of stick with this one for description purposes. So feel free to use the default trim setting or something slightly more nose up. By the way, you can try it with more nose down. The airplane's going to be trimmed for a much faster speed. It's actually much harder. Feel free to experiment. You can experiment with various flap settings, anywhere from flaps up to flaps full, something intermediate, and so on. For all the single-engine, piston-powered airplanes currently in the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 software, I will note 3 of them, and I've tried all of them. In the JMB VL3, the default trim that they use, it's really just 2 nose down. It's too fast, so really you need to move it to a more nose-up position. The Pitts S2S, a high-performance aerobatic airplane, good luck with that one, folks. Aerobatic airplanes are not designed to be stable in pitch. They're designed to be easily maneuverable. I've done it in the pits. I was sweating bullets when I was done. If you want to try it, go for it, and plus you have very poor visibility. And for what it's worth, the Extra 330 LT, another aerobatic airplane, at the time I've been testing this, and at the time I'm filming this now, there's a bug with the airplane. So if you for some reason the yaw roll coupling is reversed. In other words, if you hit left rudder, the airplane rolls right, it's backwards. That's got to be a bug in the software. There's no real world physical way that would happen. For what it's worth, I've done it that way in the Extra, and you thought I was sweating in the pits. I was sweating in the Extra because the yoke was, or the rudder was backwards. Was able to do it, and it was actually good for teaching purposes, for practice purposes. But if you want to try it in the Extra and have at it, good luck. But for a super challenge for instrument rated pilots who think, I know all this stuff, this is pretty easy, try flying an instrument approach under these constraints. Do an instrument approach using nothing but throttle and rudder. You can play with the flaps a little bit if you want, but I'd leave the flaps alone. But you can do it if you want. I've done it both ways. In the near future, my plan is to have some sample videos showing me doing this in other airplanes VMC, and in a variety of airplanes doing this IMC with instrument approaches down to minimums. But the goal of this video, and one of the takeaways, I really want you to understand pitch trim. I want you to understand that many emergencies, IMC, it's a real emergency. Day VMC, it's often, not always, not as big a deal. If the engine fails, the airplane still flies. Just deal with it, and we'll talk more about that later and so on. Bank induces nose down, and then the pitch trim is going to do its job and bring the nose back up. If you don't understand that, you won't understand why pilots die when VFR pilots get into IMC conditions. It is directly related to those little phugoid and bank exercises we were doing earlier. Pitch trim is vitally important. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on future videos and letting you try some of this stuff yourself. Thank you.